and gentlemen. This is Wiley Edmonds coming to you today, bringing you the next in the series of Dawn of Destiny. I pray that you will bear with me somewhat today because my throat has been giving me an incredible amount of difficulty. I have asthma, and of course, that coupled with the sinus and so forth, it creates a lot of problems for a speaker or a preacher in particular. Well, today we were talking about, for our lesson, the Feast of Pentecost. Now, I want to just briefly review, particularly for those who have not been watching, that we're talking about the 7 feasts of Israel. And I have repeated over and over again that the Feast of Israel, the 7 feasts that was designated and laid out by God, given to Moses in the immediate time following the exodus out of the land of Egypt. They arrived at Mount Sinai 50 days after they left on the 14th of Nisan, that being God said establishing that as the first month of the year. And on the 14th day of that month, they left Egypt and they crossed the Red Sea and they arrived at Mount Sinai 47 days after they left Egypt. And after 3 more days, God had pre-warned them and told them that He was going to give to them the law, the standards, the spiritual constitution, if you will, that they were to follow once that they were in the land of Israel and back to where that God had promised them to their father Abraham over 500 years previous to this time, this land that was going to be their inheritance, their land forever. And forever is a long time. Forever is a lot longer than just the period of time that they actually dwelt in the land, because of disobedience we know that they ultimately at one time in 1500 years later they were thrown out of their land and it was taken over by others. But the promise that God made to Abraham is a promise that was an eternal promise. It was a forever promise. That promise that would not end, even though they would be banned and exiled from their land for centuries, for millenniums even. For over 2,500 years they would be banned from their land and it would no longer be theirs. But God had said that in the last days, before His return back to this earth again to set up His eternal kingdom here, that He would establish once again the children of Israel in the land that He had given to their father Abraham. The Old Testament is literally filled with prophecies and scriptures telling us of the time when they would once again, after they were cast out of their land, that they would once again be brought back into that land of promise. Now, the 7 feasts that God established for the children of Israel to follow was what I call the backbone of the entire plan of salvation. It encompasses the entire story of the Bible. All of the verses, the chapters, the books of the Bible fill in all of the details. It puts the meat on the bone, so to speak. But nonetheless, this 7 feasts are the backbone of the plan of salvation. It is prophetic of what is going to happen to the children of Israel. The children of Israel were let me correct that. The children of Israel are the chosen people of God. Why He chose them, I don't know. I don't know that any of us know or even need to know. But what we do know is that He chose them as the people that would bring forth His Son, that one day would come back to this earth and redeem man from the fallen state that he had elapsed into during the time of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Now, these 7 feasts of Israel, as I said, they encompass the totality of the plan of salvation. We don't hear much about them. We hear a lot about, of course, Jesus and His coming and dying on the cross. his dying for the salvation of the sins of mankind. But very few people really understand all the criteria that was involved and what that meant and why he needed, why was it necessary that he should come and die for the sins of the world. And so all of that story is encompassed in the story of the 7 feasts of Israel. Now, we talked about the Feast of Passover. That, of course, was the night that they left Egypt. The angel of death passed over, and all of those, their homes, and all of those who are not ready and had not prepared, had not placed the blood on the lintel of their doorpost, the oldest child in their family died that night. And therefore, God, in remembering this and bringing it to remembrance and bringing it up as a festival each year to be celebrated in memory of them leaving Egypt and the circumstances under which they left Egypt. And that was the salvation of Israel from Egyptian bondage, to be fulfilled in Christ 2,000 years, practically 2,000 years later, when he was to come and die on the cross at Calvary. Because he was that Passover lamb that was slain at Passover. And then he was put into the grave on the eve, or not the eve, but on the dawning, which it's sort of complicated. You have to stop and think, because our days end at midnight each night. Midnight, we go from one day to the next. But under the Israelite and the Judean calendar, it ended at sundown. Each day ended at sundown every day. Sundown was the next day. That night was the next day. And that sometimes when you're reckoning and counting the days and so forth, it becomes a little bit complicated, particularly around when we're talking about what Jesus, when he came, and his death on Wednesday and so forth, as we've talked about, how that he was put into the tomb right at the dawning, right at sundown of the 15th of Nisan. And then the 15th, the all day and all night 15, all day and all night 16, all day and all night 17. And he arose then right before, right after the end of the Sabbath, which would have been as it dawned toward the 18th day of the week. Jesus rose from there, making it 3 days and 3 nights, making him fulfilling the feast of the Passover, the unleavened bread, and the feast of the first fruits. He became the first fruits of them that should rise. Now then, the next feast was a feast of Pentecost. Feast of Pentecost is right in the middle, and it is a very, very, very important feast. And the world has very little remembered it nor thought much of it. But the day of Pentecost was the day that the children of Israel, after they'd arrived at Mount Sinai as they was escaping from Egypt, that God gave the law to Moses. And God laid out all of the oracles and all of the laws that they were to observe during the period of time of their government throughout the lifetime of the Israelites. And it is called the Feast of Pentecost, particularly in the New Testament, because the word Pentecost is a Greek word, and it means 50th. That's all it means, is 50th. When God established this date with Moses, he said, Moses, what you need to do from the day of first fruits, that was the day that Jesus arose from the tomb, count or number, he said, 7 Sabbaths. That 7 Sabbaths, of course, would have been 49 days. And on the morrow, after the 49th day, would of course be the 50th day. And that was to be a day that was to be set aside, an eternal remembrance of the fact that God gave the law. Now, something very important for I want you to grasp from this day of Pentecost, or the Feast of the Harvest, also called the Feast of Weeks, in different places in the Old Testament representing or talking about the very same feast. This is one of the things that makes it slightly difficult when you're trying to understand as you read the Word of God, because so many names, dates, times, things have changed. As what they are or what we understand it is, in other words, as a prime example, the land of Iran. We hear so much about Iran. Well, Iran didn't even exist until about the, I think, 1930s, when it was always Persia, all the way back into biblical times. So many of those nations had different names back then. And so we have to identify them as we look on the map and look back into those ancient times, identify them by the names now as opposed to what they were back then. But when the Bible prophesied about them, it didn't use today's names. It used the names back then. It's for us to understand to whom and the people to whom he is speaking of. But the day that God gave Moses the law was the birthday, the literal birthday of the land of Israel. The day that God gave them the laws, the statutes, the ordinances, and all that they were to follow. That was the birthday of Israel. And as we stated before, bear in mind that Israel is God's great, big, eternal time clock. We need look no further when we come to try to understand the essence of God's prophecy and of the second coming of Jesus and of the rapture of the church, that it is all built around a timepiece. And that timepiece is none other than the nation of Israel itself. Now, being the birthday of the land of Israel, they had all the laws and all of their ordinances that they were to observe throughout their period of time that they existed. But after Jesus came and fulfilled the Passover, fulfilled the unleavened bread, fulfilled the first fruits, and arose from the dead, we must understand that it was that time, 50 days from the day that Jesus rose from the dead, would have been the day of Pentecost. Now Jesus, a few days, he lingered about 40 days with the disciples during this period of time after his resurrection and before his ascension. But he told them, he said, now you need to go back to Jerusalem and tarry there until you be filled or endued, saturated with the power from on high, because I'm going to send you someone in my place. Even though I'm going away, I'm going to prepare a place for you where I am there. You may be also. But in my stead, I'm going to send you another comforter, another advocate. And when he is come, he will teach you to observe all things whatsoever I have taught you. He will be your helper. He will be the one that you call upon for help in the time of need. And when he is come, then he will make that difference in your life so that you have an assistance or a helpmate to help you to live the Christian type life. So on that day of Pentecost, as we find recorded in the book of Acts, and the second chapter of the book of Acts, verse 1, and it there says, and when the day of Pentecost had fully come, the disciples, there was 120 out of above 400 that had gone out and was standing on the mount to watch Jesus ascend back into heaven. But out of that number, only 120 counted it important enough to go back and do what he really intended for them to do. And so they went back and they dwelt there in prayer, and they stayed in prayer and commitment and fasting and seeking God until the day of Pentecost came. And when that day come, they were all in one mind, in one place, one accord, and they were seeking the Lord. And suddenly there came a sound from heaven as of a rushing mighty wind, and it filled all the house where they were sitting. And there sat upon each of them cloven tongues like as of fire. And they began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. Now, understand this, that what is happening is everyone knows that this initiates the birthday of the church. Now Jesus said in his word, or John said in his word, John chapter 1 verse 12, that he came to his own, and his own received him not. But to as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name. So we come to understand that this is the Jesus initiating this brings about the Pentecost, the speaking in other tongues, and it brings about the birthday of the church. Because the Jews rejected him. He came to his own, they did not receive him. But as many as did, be they Jew or Gentile, or be Greek, or whatever faith or group or nationality they were, creed, color, it didn't matter. It did not matter, for as many as received him as Christ could become the children of God. And so this period of time was to go for a certain length of time. You see, because the children of Israel had rejected God and rejected him and rejected him. There's some wonderful prophecies that I would like to at some point in time teach, but it's in this format, it's too strung out. You almost need to be in a classroom setting in sequential days and so forth, because it would take a week or 10 days or a time spread out over maybe a semester to really understand the prophecy that tells about specifically the time that the Gentiles would be, God's favor turned to them, and the Jews fell out of favor with God, still his people, and still he would keep his promise that he made to Abraham, and would one day give them this land back for an eternal inheritance. But there was going to be punishment in the meantime. He said that I'm going to punish you until 7 times, and it's a beautiful, beautiful prophecy. How that when that prophecy was fulfilled on May the 14th, 1948, exactly 2,520 years to the year that God had promised or told the children of Israel that they was going to suffer the loss of their nation. And that at that time, Isaiah 66 verse 8 says that where God is speaking to Abraham, and he is challenging him to his mind to look at the fact that he was going to bring them back into their land again. That he promised them that he would, and that they would come back, and that they would become a nation in a day. And, most nations, it takes years or hundreds of years or many, many years for them to actually become a nation. Think of the United States. When people first started coming to this continent in the early 1600s, it wasn't until 1776, 77 in that period of time before that they put a nation together and declared their independence. But that didn't happen so in the land of Israel, because it was just on a very short string that a very little small window cracked open so that God could fulfill his word as to the fact that they would get their nation back. And on May the 14th, 1948, David Ben-Gurion, the leader of the Zionist Party, got up and read at midnight that night the Declaration of Independence, declaring under the sanction of the United Nations that Israel would once again be a nation. Not a divided nation as it was back in the days of the kings, where there was a Judah to the south and Israel to the north, but it would no longer be a divided nation, but it would only be one nation. And he talks about that in Ezekiel, the 36th, 37th, 38th, and 39th, and 40th chapter of the book of Ezekiel, how that they was going to be no longer two nations, but one nation when they come together, and when they got their nation back in the end, right before his coming. The disciples, when they were talking to Jesus, remember I've mentioned this repeatedly, they said, Lord, he was talking about what was going to happen. They wanted to know what was going to happen as far as the end of the world's concerned. They had that in their mind. When is the end of the world? And he began to tell them the things that would happen. And he said that the generation that is living when this begins will be the generation in which I will come back to fulfill that which my Father intended for me, to bring back and establish His kingdom upon this earth. That would be the final stage of man's sojourn upon this earth, a period of 6,000 years. Now, on that particular day, there's something else that the world has seemed to miss. And as I've said before, I grew up in Pentecostal churches. I was born and raised in Pentecost. Went to Pentecostal school. I was taught by wonderful, wonderful teachers and mentored by wonderful preachers. But never one time did I ever hear anyone tell me that on the day of May the 14th, 1948, at midnight that night, which would have been the 15th, that would have been the day of Pentecost. My. Wasn't somebody's planning right on the dot? No, they didn't. The Jews didn't have a thing in the world to do with that. That was established by the British when they set up the British Mandate in 1922, and that mandate was to be set up for 25 years. And that mandate was going to run out on May the 15th, 1948. And that allowed a window for the Jews to reestablish a nation. And that day happened to be the day of Pentecost on 1948. So on the day of Pentecost, or on the day of the Feast of the Harvest, originally, when God gave the Ten Commandments and established the nation of Israel. It was on the day of Pentecost, and we think approximately the year 30 AD, when Jesus was crucified. There's a lot of controversy about the exact day. That doesn't matter. It was still on the day of Pentecost. That was the day that the church was established. But it was on May the 14th, 1948, on the day of Pentecost, that the nation of Israel was reborn on the day of Pentecost, 1948. That really has some deep impact and deep meaning, because it is the experience of Pentecost that we, the Gentile people, have been able to experience and understand and know and have a close communion with God and have a close understanding of His Spirit and live a spiritual life that is so important, incredibly important. And that is the key, because Jesus said that Jerusalem, when in the same context in 24 Matthew, 21 Luke, is the same context that He says that Jerusalem is going to be trod down of the Gentiles until the end of the Gentiles be fulfilled. And that was a period of 19 years. Now, get this. It was 19 years from 1922 to 1948. Then it was 19 years from 1948 to 1967. Many of you still remember that 6-day war in June of 1967. I was privileged to be in Jerusalem in April of 1968. And being able to see a lot of what had gone on in that war of 1967. But it was on that day that they got the city of Jerusalem back again. Because initially, when Israel received their land back, they did not receive the portion of that land that was Jerusalem inhabited. They didn't have Jerusalem. But now then they won Jerusalem, and all those Arab nations jumped all over Israel and was going to drive them into the sea. And God intervened, and not only did they not drive them into the sea, they increased their territory by about 30%, and once again held the city of Jerusalem. That is a key point in the fact that we know that Jesus Christ is getting ready to come again real soon. And my friend, if you don't know Jesus, let me encourage you to find Him. If you know Jesus but in a very distant relationship, it's time for you to begin to hone your life and to pray and seek God and get Him into your life, so that you know that when that call is made, behold, the bridegroom cometh, go you out to meet him, that you will be ready to go with oil in your lamps. But it takes preparation. You've got to be ready. But don't let that day catch you unawares, as many will. But be open, have your eyes open, be awake, and realize that Jesus is coming soon, and that coming is imminent. The things that are going on that I could tell you about it, I don't have time. Maybe in other lessons we'll talk about it. But as time goes on, we'll mention and talk about these things, how that the preparation for those last days, the last 7 years on this earth, is going to be a period known of as the Great Tribulation. And we today, as I've said before, are right in the foothills of the mountain of great tribulation. We're just at the door. We can see all of the signs and all of the setup that's going on among the nations as they're preparing unknowingly, unwittingly, but they are fulfilling the prophecy of thus saith the word of God. And let me encourage you to pray and seek God and not let that day catch you unawares. May God bless you. Thank you for watching and putting up with my hoarse voice. Also, remember to please like and to follow and to share, if you will, and to if you see the little bell, click on the little bell so that you'll get notifications whenever this message or this Dawn of Destiny is about to be shown. May God richly bless you. Thank you.